Did you have any interactions with Chinese military sailors, officials? Like, how was your experience when you talked to them?
But extremely formal. So I had a meeting each year. If I took a carrier into a foreign port as an admiral, you'd meet, and each meeting would start with a 30-minute diatribe. There's no other way to describe it. That was a kind of a long circular discussion of the arc of Chinese history, the insults of the Western powers, the United States, culminating with a discussion of the current, failures of American policy. And then a welcome gift. At the end of all that, they hand you like a plaque. And then, usually we'd say 1 minute back of, we're happy to be here. And, maybe we're troubled by something you did in our country. We don't, I mean, just in general, I mean, that's what they practiced was the art of being an autocracy, and that's just not the United States. Now, after that, we would sometimes have reasonable discussions
Yes.
at the time of how to avoid incidents at sea, collisions between our ships. We had just started up the FONOP, Freedom of Navigation Operations program, in earnest again, and we were starting to have close approaches between ships. So there was some value in that. But listen, the PLA, look, the United States national security is run by civilians, not the military. Period, and we're very clear about that. In China, I believe it's the same way, but it's not run by the Ministry of Defense. It's run by the Chinese Communist Party in a completely different system. So, when you talk with a senior Chinese military officer, you don't believe that they have any latitude for discussion. They have talking points. They don't have left and right limits. Like when an American goes into a meeting, you have left and right limits. You can say this if you think you could be successful. You could say that, but there's limits. But there's limits, but they're left and right limits, not like a singular line of talking. The Chinese entered with a singular line of talking. That was my experience.
Okay, well, I would like to talk a little bit about the gray zone tactics. Let's say there is not a Normandy-style invasion. Like if the Chinese proceed step by step, take maybe one or two islands closer to China, or maybe blockade, or create some trouble. How could the West then react when they say, "Oh, is it really war or not? Is it bad enough?" Like, how would they react if the Chinese go really step by step?
Well, so first, you're right that we should be concerned about the gray zone. I think Russia and China throughout the 2015 to or 2012 to 2020 timeframe played the gray zone brilliantly. Whether it's Georgia, Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, the South China Sea, Hong Kong, they played it really well. And then both countries, though, have stumbled recently in the gray zone. So we got to account for that. Chinese operations in Hong Kong have been, uber overhanded, and it has cost them a lot of credibility. And obviously, for reasons that only Vladimir Putin can describe, he was running a highly successful gray zone campaign to undermine the Ukrainian government. And it was going very well. And then he took it to a new level on February 24th and invaded. When you invade, you abandon the gray zone. No one believes your disinformation anymore. No, it's almost just humorous and mocked on Twitter and stuff. Okay, so they did that. But you're saying, what if China approaches an invasion? They will. First of all, I think you're absolutely right to think that is how it starts. And I think it starts with disinformation. Despite the fact that I don't think they'll be successful, they will attempt disinformation campaigns to destabilize the government in Taipei. I think they'll try to see if there's any appetite among the Taiwan people for a peaceful reconciliation. They'll create the conditions of demonizing the United States, demonizing Japan, demonizing the governing coalition and the government. And
No,
see, I don't think they'll
we
get anywhere.
we had that before during the Ma Ying-jeou administration, where he tried to demonize Japan, and it didn't work. No,
Yeah.
he actually
I
left
don't
in
think it'll work.
disgrace.
I
Yeah,
agree, but they
it wouldn't.
will, and that will always run in the background. They will
Yes.
always be doing. They're always trying to undermine Australian elections. They're always running in the background of our own country, and they'll be running in the background of Taiwan. We just caught the Chinese, creating fake Facebook and Instagram accounts to demonize American rare earth companies in Texas that were beginning to compete potentially with
Yes.
China. So, I mean, it's constant. It's persistent and always there. I think what happens is as they decide to try to pressure and seek some kind of non kinetic solution, they'll move into significant cyber attacks that will be difficult to attribute. You know what I mean? And attribution's hard. Like, the attribution of a cyber attack, like I'll give you an example. When the Iranians do a cruise missile attack on Saudi Aramco, we know it was the Iranians in about 3 minutes, from overhead imagery, and we announce it within 3 hours. And our allies all agree with us. Everybody agrees, yep, those are. But when Iran does a cyber attack against the same Saudi Aramco, like 3 days later, like you're pretty sure it's them because they just did the kinetic one. Now here comes another one. We take like 3 or 4 months to attribute it.
Oh,
Another example, the Russians, the one good cyber attack, really good one, was the Viasat attack on the first night of the war in Ukraine. It damaged Ukrainian government and military communications. It was well executed. The timeout had some accidental secondary effects on Russian communications that they didn't expect, but still, it was pretty good. And it would have been really damaging if A, Ukraine hadn't had some resilience, but B, Elon Musk hadn't rolled in with Starlink, right? And boy, did he make some money off of that, because you got to believe Starlink terminal sales are up around the world right now. But good for him. But here's my point: the we did not attribute that virus attack, to Russia for 2 months. It happened 2 hours before the attack. It was definitely aimed at the same people that a kinetic cruise missile attack was aimed at, and we refused to attribute it. So now take this to the Taiwan scenario. China does this. They can rely on democracies. Oh, I'm not sure. Are you sure? How do we know it's the government and not just hackers? Activists and all that kind of rigmarole. And look, I don't think the Taiwan government will have any trouble saying it's China. I think it's the U.S. and Japan and Australia all getting together. So they'll have an opportunity to do a lot of cyber attacks before we finally say this is all China, and start to do offensive attacks back, cyber attacks back into China to hold them accountable, whether it's done by Taiwan or by the United States supporting Taiwan. So as you see this build up, it starts with disinformation, then cyber. Then I think you're right. They may try to see if a blockade can work. I think that's a loser for them if the United States is at all committed to Taiwan, because we can break a blockade with the best of them. If U.S. ships escort those the cargo ships in, are the Chinese going to attack U.S. shipping? And if so, how long do they think they'll be around after that? Because when we escort them in, we'll make sure we have B-1s and B-52s loaded with long-range anti-ship cruise missiles flying, on basically in an attack circle, waiting for a Chinese attack. And then they'll have pre-targeted everybody, and 15 to 20 minutes later, weapons will be screaming towards every Chinese ship within 150 miles. Because we'll say anyone sinks one of our ships, everyone within 150 miles gets sunk, because we don't know if you're a combatant, if you're a participant, a belligerent. My point on this is they may not. The one place I don't know that they have the game to stop to impose a quarantine or blockade on Taiwan if the U.S. decides it's not appropriate. So that's a big political question for you. Quarantine and blockade will not work if the United States decides it shouldn't work. We have both the submarines and the long range anti ship cruise missiles to impose our will on the Chinese Navy. And I don't think there's anything the Chinese can do about that today, in 2027 or 2030. So that's important. Now that takes you to the next level:
okay.
ballistic missile, cruise missile attacks. Now there, the Chinese will literally could release up to thousands of missiles. Now, you have to remind yourself, what's the goal of the Chinese attack? If it's to occupy Taiwan and take economic advantage of it, those cruise missile attacks are going to have to be pretty well placed. And ballistic missile attacks. There's systems that are similar to the Russian ones. You've seen the Russian cruise and ballistic missiles. They've been I think about 50 to 60% effective. They went where they were aimed. In Ukraine, that's not a very good number. Our numbers in the 90s, 90% plus, 95% plus. So I think they've done. The Chinese have to be worrying a little bit about that. Are we more accurate than the Russians? They will have targeted everything in Taiwan. They'll know where everything is. But that's why you have to move and move. Have harpoon missiles that move and harpoon missiles that move, and planes that fly out off of air.
But I
Fly.
think they have so many that they could just,
Well, you can't blanket the whole country. That I know that sounds like it. They don't have that many, but also, and then you have to decide: are there a few things that where you have some mobile air defense systems to really protect high value units, things like that. Look, that would be a tough 2 or 3 week campaign for the Taiwan people. But I believe I've been to Taiwan a few times since I got out of uniform. I wasn't allowed to when I was a general or an admiral, but since I got out, I've been there a few times. And my take was that I think the Taiwan people will demonstrate a resilience that's close to the Ukrainians if they're put under this kind of pressure by the CCP. I think they will not bend the knee very easily. So, I think they could survive that. And now you get down to they have to actually assault the island. And that's where I think Taiwan and then the United States have a big advantage. And let me tell you something: if they did that build up to get there, we'll be on station. We'll have our dozens of submarines in place. We'll have lots of these B-1s and B-52s loaded with LRASM, all in the right positions, flying out of Australia and Guam and Alaska and Japan and the continental United States. We'll have the destroyers we need. We'll have the F-35s and F-22s. You know what I mean? Here's the problem for the Chinese. If you try that gray zone buildup, you can fool us for a little bit, but we'll eventually come around, and you've actually given us pre-alertment so that we can flow our forces. If you don't do that, you got to go with the prompt strike. You got to try to jump across the strait, and then you jump into the teeth of those harpoons and slams and what limited stuff we have forward. And we're keeping more and more forward every year in terms of submarines and surface ships, B-1s and B-52 missile system, the missiles that they carry, things like that. We're starting to defend Guam so that we can use it as an anchor, at least for a few weeks, to try to do it. We'll be flying out of Australia. Is China willing to strike Australia? Is China willing to strike Japan as
yeah,
part of
that's
this?
the question. Would
Yeah.
they nuke any of those countries? Because
Well,
so far they've been
I don't think
threatening
they
the
would.
US for 2 decades, recently Japan and Australia. And, they're really much more serious about this than Putin.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Since I think the number one thing to the Chinese Communist Party is regime survivability, nuclear war is kind of a loser, right? You're out. So I don't think they go there. But I think, listen, I think we can deter this. I think we can if we continue to push things forward, if the Australians, continue to make the right purchases, the Japanese continue to make the right purchases, and they're really interoperable with us. It is just an unbelievably fortunate circumstance we have that all four, including Taiwan, all four of these countries have been buying the right things for the last few years. And look, the U.S. should be buying more, but we're protected a little bit by the Japanese buys and the Australian buys. They're buying U.S. gear, we're sharing our latest weapon systems. We're going to, in fact, buy for our new AWACS. I think we're going to buy the Australian AWACS. And I think once we buy it, the Japanese will buy it. And then you'll suddenly have the best AWACS all integrated. And that'll give us a really good opportunity for air, if not air superiority, but the ability to establish air dominance for short periods of time where we need to. This is all important stuff. So listen, we should all be nervous. We all have to make the right investments, but there's an absolute path to success here. This is not, we are not Ukraine facing Russia, where it's a really challenging thing to think about how Ukraine pushes Russia out of eastern Ukraine and out of Crimea. That's the geography there really is just so helpful to Russia. Not as much. Taiwan may be close to China. That 80 kilometers of sea means something.
The US has a lot of options, much softer ones. Like there is so many CCP elites in the States. She's daughter, she studies in the States. Like, couldn't they leverage somehow, tell those people, look, either you share some information or you cooperate with us, or, throw them or expel them. Like, there is some leverage there, I think.
And again, if we were an authoritarian state, we'd probably sign up for
I
that,
know, but
and
that's a
certainly,
special condition here.
yeah, I don't think we're going to do that here. I don't think you win by sacrificing the principles you kind of believe in as a country. And look, I say that we have made that error in the past. I think, look, why do we love Taiwan? Their vibrant democracy. They have crazy elections, but they have elections, and when somebody loses, they give up power. In the United States, we've always had that. We had one little perturbation recently, but the loser gives up power. That is the sign of a democracy. There's capitalism. There's some great capitalist companies in Taiwan, excessively successful. There's vibrant, there's a free press that's hypercritical of the president when they feel like it. That's the same in the United States. They are what we, you know, Taiwan is an outward representation of the American ideal.
Yeah, a best
That's
case
what we defend
scenario.
them.
Yeah.
So my take, and so is Japan in ways. And look, not everyone's perfect. Australia as well. We're very similar. I think when you get to India, it gets a little more complicated, and South Korea sometimes a little more complicated. But in general, the four of our countries really share a lot. And so that's why I say I don't think I'm willing to say. Look, what I am willing to say is we've got to figure out how to impose cost outside of military tools, which I think is what you're getting at. How do we use economic tools, cultural tools, information tools, diplomatic tools? And believe me, it's going to be a lot harder. I mean, if we think Russia was hard, China's going to be much harder because the country feeling the pain won't be our European allies; it'll be us. And so, we're going to have to figure out how we do these sanctions. And look, you're absolutely right. If we got in a really aggressive campaign with China, we might ask senior leader family members to leave, and ask in the verb of putting them on a plane whether they want to or not and leave, things like that. But that's, I can only envision that if things got right near combat. And Xi would want I'm pretty sure he'd want his family back in China. Um, but really, that's not our game. I do think we have to be very vigilant and looking at the Chinese Confucius Institutes and Chinese intellectual property plays both in academia and in startups and and venture capital. I think they're very nefarious. I think there's very little good that comes of that justifies the bad. That doesn't mean Chinese students can't study here. That doesn't mean they can't remain here afterwards and become U.S. citizens. But it does mean we have to be very vigilant and watching where they're working, what they're working on, and whether their intent is nefarious. And we have not done a good job at that. And the FBI, over the last year and a half, Director Wray, the head of the FBI, has made it really clear that while Russia bothers him, China is his fixation, and what China is doing to us in terms of intellectual property theft and criminal behavior, criminal espionage.
On that note, my last question would be about the cyberspace. Like, how does China and the US compare there? I mean, they steal a lot of IP. And yeah, but I think that's probably the area where the US should be much more advanced than China, or not?
So you're right. And now, here's one of the problems. What IP we're trying to steal from China? I mean, I get why they're trying to steal IP from us, and we should
Yes.
be more vigilant about it. I think the area where, and look, when you think about offensive operators, offensive cyber operators, I would guess they have 6 to 10 times as many as we do, maybe even more. I don't think that makes them 6 to 10 times better. I think probably most of the unclassified discussions of this say that the United States is on one level and China and Russia are on a slightly lower level. And I think that's probably accurate. But the key here is Taiwan, right? The key here is Japan. The key is Australia, those countries whose infrastructure the United States needs to fight from. Singapore, those countries have to have good cyber defenses to withstand the Chinese attacks. And here's a great lesson from Ukraine. Ukraine was hammered in 2015 and 2016 by electrical power grid attacks by Russia. Then in 2017, the more famous NotPetya attack on the financial and services and government sector that leaked into Western Europe and caused $10 billion worth of damage to Maersk and Merrick and Mondelez and all that. Uh, We then began to work with Ukraine, both with USAID grants and then Cyber Command called Hunt Forward missions, and really help develop their their cyber resilience. Now, look, the Europeans helped. The Ukrainians did a ton of work on their own, and they've done much better than one would expect resiliency wise in their electrical power grid and other areas. There's a lesson learned here for the US and Taiwan. We should be working together very aggressively with Cyber Command Hunt Forward mission forces, with the United States giving advice on software companies that should be brought in to help, that help the U.S. military and U.S. government, help the Taiwanese military and Taiwanese government. U.S. and Taiwanese cyber operators should sit side by side, looking for vulnerabilities in Taiwan infrastructure, so we can identify them and remediate them so they're gone. We should be doing the same in Japan, the same in Australia, and I think we are, and we just need to really increase that game. And that's what's critical. And then, of course, we should each be developing our own offensive cyber operations. Countries tend not to share that too much, their tools and tactics and such. But I think we should share some basic and mid-level stuff. Probably the high-level stuff we'll keep to ourselves. The Australians will keep to themselves. The Japanese and Taiwanese will keep to themselves. But we need to work that together. And there's a great opportunity there. And again, a penny of investment is worth a pound of pain later on. If we can make those investments now, we're going to spare ourselves a lot of pain after a conflict starts.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, the discussion was quite optimistic.
Well, again, I'm speaking to how things will be if we make
Yes,
the
yes, I
proper
understand.
investments, and then I'm
Yes,
recommending the investments. You're absolutely right. If we just pitter patter along,
yes.
it's going to be painful in 2026, 2027.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Richard. This was a great discussion.
Thank you very much.